He's going to be all mixed up with all these questions.
And the New English Bible. Nothing could be more timely since the publication date of this New English Bible last Tuesday of this week, on March 14th. Lord willing, next month, April the 21st, on a Friday again, Dr. Glenn O'Neill, who's professor of practical theology, will be speaking on the subject, An Evangelical Look at Pastoral Counseling, Translation, and the New English Bible. I do not think we could have chosen a man better fitted than the gentleman who is to speak to us this evening. Dr. Robert Thomas is professor and chairman of the Department of New Testament and Talbot Theological Seminary. After completion of his undergraduate work in a very reputable institution in Georgia, he finished all the disciplines in theology, majoring in his highest work in the realm of New Testament, where he completed his work with eminent distinction. He is now serving in Talbot Seminary. It's a blessing not only to student body, but to colleagues and to the church at large. It's a real privilege to introduce to this audience Dr. Robert L. Thomas for his lecture. New talents all the time. Thank you, Dr. Feinberg. The first section of our paper this evening we would entitle Background. In recent days, the Christian world has been buzzing with excitement over the publication of the New English Bible. The question upon the lips of one and all seems to be, is it a good translation? The question is not so easily answered as some might suppose, because there is not unanimous agreement among scholars as to just what comprises a good translation. For this reason, in answering this question in relation to the New English Bible, it is necessary to examine a number of matters which pertain to the background of this translation. Prior to World War II, there was a movement afoot in Great Britain to revise the revised version of the Bible, which was published in 1881 and 1885. The work of revision had already begun when the war interrupted proceedings, and the effort had to be discontinued. It is to be noted that a similar movement was underway in the United States and Canada, having begun in 1937 to revise the American Standard Version of the Bible, which had the publication date of 1901 in the United States. This version very closely resembles the revised version of 1881 and 1885. The latter endeavor, in contrast to the former, was not discontinued during the period of the world conflict, and the revised Standard Version of the New Testament was published in 1946. The same version of the Old Testament had its initial publication date in 1952. In May 1946, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland adopted a recommendation that a translation of the Bible be made in the language of the present day. This decision represents a radical departure from the dominant tradition which has produced the major English translations since the time of Tyndale. The Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, the Authorized or King James Version, the Revised Version, and the Revised Standard Version are merely products of the revision of an earlier translation. The reason for the decision on the part of the Church of Scotland was the motive of providing English readers, whether familiar with the Bible or not, with a faithful rendering of the best available Greek text into the current speech of our own time. It was felt that the changes which would be required to accomplish such a purpose would make a revision of an earlier version impractical. Another reason may be suggested, though it has not been stated. That is, the realization that if a revision were undertaken, there would be an overlapping of the work done with the undertaking of the committee in America, which had almost completed its revision of the American Standard Version by this time. Invitations were extended by the Church of Scotland for others to join in this undertaking. The invitations were accepted, and the response to such a suggestion was enthusiastic. The result of subsequent meetings of various groups is that the work published jointly by Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press is sponsored by the following denominations and organizations: the Baptist Union of Great Britain and Ireland, the Church of England, the Church of Scotland, the Congregational Union of England and Wales, the Council of Churches for Wales, the London Yearly Meeting of the Society of Friends, the Methodist Church of Great Britain, the Presbyterian Church of England, the United Council of Christian Churches and Religious Communions in Ireland, the British Foreign and Bible Society, and the National Bible Society of Scotland. The only major denomination which is not represented in this group is the Roman Catholic denomination. Following the organizational stages of the movement, scholars were selected from various British universities to undertake the work of translation. They were selected apart from any consideration of a denominational affiliation and were appointed to 4 panels. The 4 panels were to work in 4 areas: the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Apocrypha, and that of literary and stylistic considerations. The panel dealing with the New Testament, in which there is particular interest at present, was composed of 7 scholars, all of whom are very well versed in the field of New Testament studies. Dr. C.H. Dodd was appointed convener of the New Testament panel. Dr. Dodd, who is Emeritus Professor of the University of Cambridge, has also been appointed General Director of the whole translation. The next step in the process was to allot each book of the New Testament to a translator, who was a member of the panel. When the translator had completed his task, his first draft was sent to all members of the panel. At the next meeting of the panel, the entire committee would work through the book, verse by verse and sentence by sentence. After the panel had made its alterations in the translation, the revision was submitted to the literary panel. The literary advisors had as their goal the correcting of any awkward or unintelligible constructions or words which may have escaped the notice of the New Testament panel. The overall purpose of the translation is to reproduce the meaning of the biblical passages in the language utilized by the newspapers of Great Britain, that which was familiar to everyone. To this end, the literary advisors devoted themselves. After receiving the suggestions of the literary panel, the New Testament panel convened to consider just how many of the suggestions could be received without departing from the sense of the original language. When the translation panel had completed their work, the result was submitted to the joint committee composed of the representatives of the sponsoring denominations and organizations. The Joint Committee formally accepted the New Testament part of the translation near the end of March 1960, and the same was published on March 14, 1961, just 3 days ago. It is not the purpose of the present speaker to make an attempt to criticize the scholarship which went into the preparation of this translation. Such an effort would be foolhardy. Neither is it his intent to present a matured judgment upon the finished product. If the work of translation required the efforts of many scholars laboring for a period of more than 10 years, it is obvious that one individual cannot properly evaluate the work in detail in a matter of weeks. It seems much more worthwhile at this juncture to examine the philosophy of translation which stands behind this work, which has so recently come off the press. 3 questions may be asked in this connection. What is the philosophy of translation? Has the purpose of the translation been attained? Is the philosophy of the translation valid? In seeking to answer these questions, the speaker is not giving the official position of any institution, but is merely expressing his own personal viewpoint. First of all, what is the philosophy of the translation? When one thinks of philosophy of translation, 2 extremes in viewpoint immediately come to mind. The first ideal in the matter of translation is that which is associated by tradition with the University of Cambridge in England. The Cambridge method aims at translating the words and phrases of the original as literally as possible, provided that no actual violence is done to the English usage. The primary consideration in this approach is faithfulness to the original. A suitable description of this philosophy has been set forth by Dr. Francis R. Steele. I quote Dr. Steele. A translation should convey as much of the original text in as few words as possible, yet preserve the original atmosphere and emphasis. The translator should strive for the nearest approximation in words, concept, and cadence. He should scrupulously avoid adding words or ideas not demanded by the text. His job is to explain, or rather, his job is not to expand or to explain, but to translate and preserve the spirit and force of the original, even if need be at the expense of modern colloquialism, so long as the resultant translation is intelligible. End of quotation. If this philosophy were strictly observed, many of the practices among present-day translators, which are looked upon as loose practices by some, would be avoided. The opposite approach to translation is one which has become connected traditionally with the University of Oxford in England. The aim of the Oxford method is to convey the sense of the translated passage in free and idiomatic English without much regard for the exact wording of the original. The primary concern to those who approach translation from this viewpoint is readability. How does it sound when I read it? The end in view is the conveying of the thought of the original to the reader without regard for a word-for-word correspondence between the original and the translation. From the very nature of the case, it is apparent that this latter philosophy involves a greater amount of interpretation on the part of the translator than does the former. To an advocate of this position, the ideas, not the words themselves, are of utmost importance. The translators of the older versions, including the King James Version and the American Standard Version, adopted the first philosophy of translation. They felt that fidelity to the original demanded that they should reproduce insofar as was possible the characteristic features of the language in which the New Testament was written. This included the preservation of the syntactical order of words, the structure and division of sentences, and a word-for-word correspondence wherever possible. The translators of the New English Bible, we might put in parenthesis here that apparently this new Bible will be known as the NEB, the New English Bible. The translators of the New English Bible, however, were instructed to replace Greek constructions and idioms with those of contemporary English. This basic difference between the two approaches means that the modern translators have adopted the second philosophy of translation, which has as its primary concern readability and smoothness. This practice in translation lays a heavier burden upon him who is appointed to translate, because his task is to understand the original as precisely as he is able, and then to say again in his own native idiom what he believes the author to be saying in his. As the literary panel would review the translation of each book, verse by verse and sentence by sentence, they would ask several questions. Is this English idiom and not translation English? Is this present-day English idiom? Is this the proper translation for the type of literature being translated? The aim was to produce a work which would be intelligible to three groups: the interested outsider, the school children in the schools of Great Britain, and the believing and practicing Christians. Taken as a whole, the New English Bible, therefore, claims to be a free translation rather than a literal one. Yet, it denies the accusation that, taken as a whole, it is a paraphrase, defining a paraphrase as a work which introduces into a passage something which is not there. Still, there is the admission that in places there has been recourse made to paraphrase. To at least a limited degree, this version partakes of the character of a commentary, although the desire is expressed not to encroach upon the field of the commentator. The introduction to the New English Bible calls the work a free translation, but apparently admits that it partakes at least in part of the character of a paraphrase and of the character of a commentary or an interpretation. So much for the philosophy of the translation. Has the purpose of the translation been attained? Has the purpose of the translation been attained? In adopting a certain philosophy of translation, one commits himself in his purpose to attain certain ends. In the case of the latest version, the purpose in view has been the production of a piece of literature which would be understandable to the ordinary reader, proper in its literary style, and faithful to the Greek original in its meaning. In the estimation of the speaker, these goals have been attained in the major part of the New Testament translation. The accomplishment of these ends is not difficult to understand when one remembers the high caliber of scholarship which is represented on the panels.
Here are 7 men on the New Testament panel who have given their lives to the study of the New Testament books. It is obvious that their interpretations are not based upon hastily drawn conclusions. Selected to serve on the literary panel are men who are experts in that field. How could the result fail to be anything but superior? The merits of this translation could be illustrated abundantly. Perhaps the following selected passages will prove the high quality of the product. First of all, in Matthew chapter 20, verse 5. In the King James Version of Matthew chapter 20 and verse 5, the householder is said to have gone out, quote, about the 6th and 9th hour. Realizing that these time designations, which represent a literal translation, by the way, recognizing that these time designations would mean little or nothing to the average English reader, the translators of the New Version have rendered the same verse, at noon he went out again, and at 3 in the afternoon. Obviously, this would be intelligible to a present-day English reader. In Matthew 17:24, the American Standard Version renders the Greek term didrachma by its equivalent in Jewish coinage, the half shilling. The New Translation goes one step further by way of interpretation to render the term temple tax. This policy is helpful to the reader of Matthew because from the rendering of the earlier version it is not immediately obvious whether this is a religious tax or a political tax. Neither is it clear to him that the didrachma, or the half shilling, was the amount of the temple tax. In Matthew 27:62, the translators are found adopting the traditional viewpoint of the day of crucifixion of Christ, whereas earlier versions left it to the discretion of the reader of the English text by the rendering preparation. The latest effort interprets the Greek term, referring to the Jewish preparation, by what they feel is the corresponding day of the week, Friday. Next day, the morning after Friday, the chief priests and the Pharisees came in a body to Pilate. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, of course, is a very familiar and a very well-liked and appreciated chapter. The understandability and beauty of style of the translation which we have recently received is well seen in the rendering of the Grace Love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. I may speak in tongues of men or of angels, but if I am without love, I am a sounding gong or a clanging cymbal. I may have the gift of prophecy and know every hidden truth. I may have faith strong enough to move mountains, but if I have no love, I am nothing. I may dole out all I possess or even give my body to be burnt, but if I have no love, I am none the better. Love is patient. Love is kind and envies no one. Love is never boastful, nor conceited, nor rude, never selfish, not quick to take offense. Love keeps no score of wrongs, does not gloat over other men's sins, but delights in the truth. There is nothing love cannot face. There is no limit to its faith, its hope, and its endurance. We end our reading at verse 7. Surely the understandability and beauty of this passage cannot be questioned. The appeal which this version will have for young and old alike may be predicted on the basis of a number of passages which at first glance are shocking to the reader. After consideration, however, it is seen how these English idioms convey the intended meaning. Several instances will demonstrate the point. In the King James Version, Hebrews 5:12 is rendered, For the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. In the New Bible, the translation is as follows: For indeed, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the ABC of God's oracles over again. It has come to this, that you need milk instead of solid food. The letters ABC appearing in the text of Scripture are startling to the reader. But as he meditates upon the point, he can see how the author's meaning is conveyed. The American idiom is slightly different from that of the translators, ABCs rather than ABC. Again, in Luke 3:15, the King James Version translators rendered the words describing John the Baptist's hearers in the following manner. Luke 3:15. And as the people were in expectation, and all the men mused in their hearts whether he were the Christ or not, the New Translation gives the following treatment. The people were on the tiptoe of expectation, all wondering about John whether perhaps he was the Messiah. The expression, the tiptoe of expectation, is quite unusual, and causes the reader to stop for a moment and consider whether or not such liberty is justified. The translator of Luke seems to be especially fond of such expressions. A further example is found in Luke 8:34. This is the occasion of the feeding, or rather of the sending of the swine into the lake to be drowned. The one who had charge of the swine, according to the literal rendering, or rather the ones who had charge, according to the literal rendering, they fled. For this word, which is literally they fled, the translator gives taking to their heels. The same tendency may be observed in Acts 7:54. At the conclusion of the speech of Stephen before the Sanhedrin, the King James Version describes the effect of Stephen's words on the Sanhedrin as follows: They were cut to the heart. The New English Bible gives this idiomatic equivalent. This touched them on the raw. It must be admitted that this wording is very graphic. A passage which has proved a puzzle to the readers of the older versions is found in the teaching connected with the parable of the unjust steward in Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. The verse which has been a particular problem is Luke 16:9. The version of 1611, the King James Version, reads, "And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when ye fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitation." The meaning of this verse is obscure to some extent in the versions which have been made, and even a consideration of the Greek text does not disclose immediately the intent of the words. The version of 1961, however, has done an excellent job of clarifying just what the Lord meant. "So I say to you, use your worldly wealth to win friends for yourselves, so that when money is a thing of the past, you may be received into an eternal home." Concern of the translators for a proper understanding by the reading public cannot be demonstrated more effectively than by the instance of Mark 9:5. This is the transfiguration scene. Peter's suggestion in this verse to the Lord is that the disciples erect 3 tabernacles, one for the Lord himself, one for Moses, and one for Elias. Preliminary work which had been done by these translators on the Gospel of Mark prior to World War II had changed the word tabernacle because it conveyed to the present-day mind the thought of a larger and more permanent structure. The new word suggested was shelter. Following World War II, when the work was taken up again, however, the word shelter also was found to be unsatisfactory, because the suggestion to the minds of the British people was that of a bomb shelter. The new translators departed from this word for a time, therefore, but later returned to it when the recollections of war experiences had faded away. In considering the success of the translation, one other matter which does not relate directly to the philosophy of translation should be introduced. This has to do with the meaning of the words which go together to make up the Greek Testament, the Greek New Testament. Discoveries of many thousands of papyri documents in the last 80 years have greatly increased the understanding of the shades of meaning of words and of the Greek idiom. For example, in Matthew 25:15, there is recorded the parable of a man who went away on a journey and left one of his servants 5 talents. He left one of his servants 2 talents, and he left one of his servants 1 talent. The word talent to an English person today speaks of something entirely different from what it did in that day. Therefore, this English rendering obscures the original concept. It has been discovered that a talent was a gold coin, and archaeological discoveries have further shown that talents were carried in a bag. When the translators of the New Testament, or rather of the New English Bible, came to this term, rather than leave the expression ambiguous or allow it to be misleading, they have rendered the expression 5 talents by the word 5 bags of gold. Thus, there is this added value to the work, that it incorporates the latest information in the meanings which are attached to Greek words. Our next question: is the philosophy of the translation valid? The value of a free translation such as has now been placed into the hands of the public is obvious. There is extended consideration for just what the reading public can comprehend, extensive effort to make the style pleasing, good scholarship, and the inclusion of the latest discoveries of archaeology. It would be difficult for anyone to object to these advantages, which are found in the new production. It is the opinion of the speaker, however, that there are also some basic problems which are involved in the work as we have now received it. For the most part, these stem from the philosophy which forms the basis for the translation. It is a non-literal translation, and by virtue of this fact, certain disadvantages are encountered. The first disadvantage may be termed a theological one. The reader of the New English Bible is at the mercy of the theological prejudices of the translators. The testimony of the translators is, and I quote, "We have conceived our task to be that of understanding the original as precisely as we could, and then saying again in our own native idiom what we believed the author to be saying in his." We found that in practice this frequently compelled us to make decisions where the older method of translation allowed a comfortable ambiguity. In the end, we accept the collective responsibility for the interpretation set forth in the text of our translation. End of quotation. The speaker is glad to state his own opinion that in the great majority of the interpretations, the translators are correct. But there remain these other instances where the reader may be misled. A case in point is the parable of Luke 19:11 through 27. It is difficult to go into the detail of this parable in a survey such as this. There will only be the attempt to indicate the fallacy and allow the individual to follow it up for himself. In this parable, the Greek noun basileia occurs 3 times, and in each case is rendered so as to conform to the position of covenant theology as it is manifest in amillennialism and non-dispensational premillennialism. The word in question is rendered in verse 11 by the English word reign, R-E-I-G-N. The word in question is paraphrased in verses 12 and 15 so that one cannot discern that such a word is present. The same word is given a similar treatment in Acts 1:6, where the question of the restoration of the kingdom to Israel is interpreted by the word the sovereignty of Israel. The word in question is normally translated kingdom, basileia, kingdom. But the theological prejudices of any non-dispensational approach requires its adherents to exclude from the term any reference to a realm or a people who constitute a part of the kingdom. By this means, they escape the obvious references to a literal earthly kingdom by the Lord at his first advent. In order to escape these implications, it is convenient to render the word in the above passages in some way other than by the English word kingdom. Another strong deficiency from the theological standpoint is found in the following passages in Matthew 13:39, 13:40, 13:49, and 28:20. In these passages, the very important eschatological phrase referring to the consummation of the age is translated by the word the end of time. This rendering does violence to the Greek and to practically any system of eschatology which seeks to discover the scriptural outline of future events. The theological disadvantage of such a free translation as this presents problems not only to dispensationalism, but also to the system of covenant theology. The adherents of the latter position will be hard-pressed on the basis of the New Version's renderings of Ephesians 3:5. They will be hard-pressed to refute the truth that the church composed of Jew and Gentile was not a subject of revelation in the Old Testament. This feature, of course, is basic to dispensationalism. The standard dispensational position that the church is unrevealed until New Testament times is staunchly upheld by the interpretation placed upon this verse by the translators. In former generations, this was not disclosed to the human race, but now it has been revealed by inspiration to his dedicated apostles and prophets. Another theological inadequacy lies in the field of soteriology. It is feared that the translators have obscured many of the doctrines which are held precious by Christians in relation to their own salvation. An example is the doctrine of imputed righteousness. In Romans 1:17, the word which speaks of the believer's righteousness in Christ, and the righteousness of Christ as imputed to believers, the word dikaiosune, is greatly obscured. Literally, the phrase is, "For a righteousness of God is revealed in it," that is, the gospel. But the NEB renders, "Because here is revealed God's way of righting wrong." The same rendering is given the word in Romans 3:22. But in Romans 3:5, Romans 3:21, Romans 3:25, Romans 3:26, the word is translated justice. When the translator moves into Romans 4, he finally renders the word by the more familiar English word righteousness. This inconsistency will obscure the logical development of the book, not to mention the precious teaching that the righteousness of Christ comes to be imputed to the one who places his faith in Jesus Christ. A second disadvantage in this philosophy of translation might be termed an exegetical disadvantage. A person who is interested in studying the Word of God and must do so on the basis of the English text will not want to center his attention upon this verse. For example, in 1 Corinthians 14, the New Bible obscures the Greek term glossa, meaning tongue. It obscures this term in an even greater way than did the King James Version. It will be recalled that the King James Version, in most of the occurrences of the word in this chapter, translated the word unknown tongue. That word unknown appears in italics in your version, of course, because it was not a part of the original. In the New Translation, however, a different rendering is given the word in almost every occurrence. It is translated language of ecstasy, ecstatic utterance, tongues of ecstasy, ecstatic speech, ecstatic language, and strange tongues of ecstasy. These are all translations of one Greek word within one chapter of the Bible. Not only is this variety a disadvantage, but also there's the disadvantage that a very possible and plausible interpretation of the nature of these tongues is obscured by the use of some form of the word ecstasy in each case. By means of this word, any relationship between the gift of tongues in 1 Corinthians and the gift of tongues in Acts 2 is automatically excluded. If the aim of translation should be the production of the same effect on the reader of the translation as the original wording produced in the reader of the original text, then there is much to be said for translating the same original word by the same English word in a given passage. Consider for a moment the statement of Richard III. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. What is it that gives force to this statement? It is, of course, the repetition of the word horse. This is seen very easily when one changes the second and third occurrences of the word. A horse, a beast of burden, my kingdom for a stallion. Yet, it has been the purpose of the translators of the New Version to use as many synonyms as possible in order to attain beauty of style. The usage of the Greek word dikaiosune, already cited in chapters 1 through 4 of Romans, illustrates this tendency. The untaught reader of the English will see no relationship between God's way of righting wrong, God's justice, and righteousness. And thus the emphasis brought about by the apostles' continual dwelling upon the theme is lost. The inadequacy of this approach is further illustrated by a passage in the 2nd chapter of 1 John. In the section found in 1 John 2:17 through 28, the Greek verb meno is found 8 times, a feature which points to the obvious attempt on the part of John to emphasize the thought of abiding. The New English Bible in 4 cases gives the meaning dwell. In 2 cases, the meaning stay is found. In 1 case, there is found the word stand. And in the remaining usage, the translator gives keep. In the same passage of the American Standard Version, 7 of the 8 occurrences are translated abide. And the remaining 1 continue. Admittedly, the beauty of the translation of the New English Bible is greater than the beauty of the translation of the American Standard Version. But the latter version is more faithful in maintaining the emphasis of the Greek original. In the most recent version, one who reads the version, reads the style of the translator, not that of John. A third area of disadvantage might be described as a textual disadvantage. A looseness in this area seems to go hand in hand with the philosophy of free translation. One of the avowed purposes of the New Testament panel was to incorporate into the project the great advances which have been made in the field of textual criticism in the last 80 years. It is the fear of the speaker, however, that the NEB has not capitalized upon the advantages which are available to the translator of the present day. 2 reasons for this opinion may be given. The first is the failure of the translators to follow a uniform method of textual criticism in the determination of the best text. According to the introduction to the Bible, the present translators could do no other than consider variant readings on their own merit, and having weighed the evidence for themselves, select for translation in each passage the reading which, to the best of their judgment, seemed most likely to represent what the author wrote. The reason given for this procedure is the lack of agreement among New Testament scholars at the present time as to what the correct critical text is. That is, the text which most closely approximates the original writing of the author himself. Nevertheless, it would seem that a uniform method which might stand in doubt would be preferable to no method at all. As the translation now stands, some readings are based upon the most ancient Greek text. Other readings are based upon Greek texts which are quite late. And still others which are cited seem to have their primary basis in several early versions, such as the Latin or Syriac. For this reason, one cannot be sure whether he is reading a translation which has a sound textual basis or a translation based upon a text which is the product of the opinion of whoever happened to be the translator of that particular book. For example, in Matthew 4:17, a footnote suggests the omission of the word repent for. The passage, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. A footnote suggests the omission of the first two words, repent for. The only evidence listed for such an omission in Nestle's text consists of an old Latin translation, two Syriac translations, and three of the early church fathers. A further illustration of the point is found in Matthew 27:16 and 17, where the name Jesus is inserted into the body of the text, and in the footnote there is suggested the omission of the name in some witnesses. An examination of Nestle's listing of evidence reveals that the only evidence for the insertion of the name comes from a Greek manuscript of the 9th century, quite late, a group of minuscules which would date from the same century or later, two Syriac translations, and the early church father Origen. The evidence in favor of the reading is quite weak. Nevertheless, it is given a place in the body of the translation. This lack of uniformity in the method of determining the correct text of the New Testament leaves the translators open to a criticism which could not be directed at the translators of the King James Version in 1611 and the Revised Version in 1881. There was in those cases a standard text used consistently by each of these earlier versions. And right or wrong, the critical text was known and the version could be evaluated on that basis. In the light of this point alone, one might question the feasibility of making a new translation until such a time as New Testament scholars might come to an agreement upon an adequate approach to the science and art of textual criticism. A second reason for the opinion of the speaker that the translators have failed to capitalize upon the advantages which are now available to the textual critic relates to the system of footnoting used in the new version. To be specific, in Mark 16, the reader of the English text is left to make his own choice between a number of possible endings for the gospel. The first possibility is to end the gospel with the last word in verse 8. A second possibility is to end the gospel with two sentences which have hitherto appeared in the body of no major English translation. These two sentences are printed in the body of the New English Bible without a number between Mark 16:8 and Mark 16:9, and a footnote pertaining to them records the following words. Some witnesses add this paragraph, which in one of them is the conclusion of the book. Another alternative presented to the reader is to end the book with the words of verses 9 through 20, as we have them in the King James Version, instead of with the words which are printed as an unnumbered verse following verse 8. A fourth alternative is to end the book with the words of verses 9 through 20 in addition to the newly inserted paragraph, which is printed between verses 8 and 9. This highly debatable conclusion, that is, this alternative, is that which is adopted in the body of the New English Bible itself. A fifth alternative is to add other matter which is not cited in addition to one of the above endings. Such a procedure as this takes a problem which rightfully belongs to the highly trained textual critic of the New Testament and transfers it to the untrained reader of the English version. The English reader is then forced to make his own decision when in reality he has no basis upon which to make it. His decision therefore becomes a process of choosing which reading suits his own fancy. Another passage where this policy is well illustrated is in the case of the highly questionable section in John 7:53 through 8:11. This passage is printed at the conclusion of the Gospel of John in the New English Bible. And on the basis of the footnote, the reader is left to decide between a number of possibilities, because, as it is stated, this passage has no fixed place in our ancient witnesses. The passage may be read in the same location as in the King James Version, that is, following John 7:52 and preceding John 8:12. It may be omitted completely from the pages of the New Testament. It may be placed after Luke 21:38. It may be inserted following John 7:36. It may be accepted in the position in which it is found in the New English Bible, immediately after John 21:24. Textual support for placing the passage here is very weak, however. Even if it be granted that there is some textual support for each of these alternatives, even though in some cases it is quite weak, how is the person without a theological training to determine which alternative is to be accepted? One who believes in the plenary verbal inspiration of the Bible wants to know the exact words which were written and the exact place where they were written. His curiosity will not be satisfied by the New English Bible, however. A further illustration which might be cited is Romans 16:25-27. This doxology, which closes the Roman epistle according to the reader's own personal preference, may be given one of the following positions. The position which it occupies in the King James Version at the conclusion of Romans 16, a position at the end of Romans 14, a position at the end of chapter 15 of Romans, or it may be omitted altogether. A fourth inadequacy of such a free translation might be termed an idiomatic disadvantage. The idiomatic English utilized in the translation was designed to be intelligible to the English-speaking people of Europe, not of America. As might be expected in the light of this stated purpose, quite a number of idioms which are unintelligible to the American ear will be encountered by the readers of this Bible. Specifically, very few Americans will know what the term Whitsuntide, as it is found in 1 Corinthians 16:8, refers to. Whitsuntide is an ecclesiastical term referring to the seventh Sunday after Easter and the week which follows it. Probably the translation Pentecost, which is found in the King James Version, would be more effective.